Oh, hey, welcome everybody. It's nice to see such a lovely turnout tonight. I think you'll be glad you came. Always start with a prayer, huh? In the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Loving God, we thank you for drawing our hearts to a talk about refugees and their experience. It's a world apart, and yet it's not. We have people from far away coming to Eau Claire and seeking a safe place. But most of what we read about, if you read the book or will hear about, are stories both of suffering, perhaps cruelty, and also hope and love and undefeatable human spirit. And we thank you for sending us Stephanie tonight, a beautiful spirit herself. She comes with a very compassionate heart and with a steel conviction underneath that heart. And she's been a great gift to all those who've known her in this world. And we thank you for bringing her to Eau Claire. Bless this night. Bless our ears that we may hear what is helpful to hear. And bless our speaker, Stephanie, tonight. And keep her safe in her travels. This is her last night of her nationwide tour. And she's canceled her last night because she needs to get back because they're maybe going to close the borders and things because of the war. And so, Lord, bring her home safely, and I'll bring peace to your world and the justice that leads to lasting peace. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so without further ado, come on over, Stephanie.
This is a really extraordinary turnout tonight, so thank you so much. And what a beautiful last evening for me to have before returning home. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and to really share about this journey that has taken up the last 8 years of my life, meeting folks who have escaped war with their families often, and trying to understand what they carried with them. As a backstory, I've lived in the Middle East for about 20 years, and this sort of transformative year for me was a year that I spent in Syria. Syria was famously a very, very friendly place. I mean, so friendly that if you were living there, you'd have to come up with alternate ways to get home, because if you went the normal way, so many people would ask you in that you'd never get home. So if you needed to get someplace in 5 minutes, you would just sneak around the back. A place so friendly that you learn not to compliment people's jewelry because they would take it off and give it to you. A kind of place of extraordinary compassion and warmth, where people loved good food, friendship, where they spoke a beautiful dialect of Arabic. It's where I learned my Arabic, where I met my husband, who was a novice monk. He left the monastery to marry me, and now he is a married priest. So as I say, I took him and gave him back again. And where I had some of my greatest teachers and friends. So when the war started, it wasn't just war for me. You can imagine what would happen if there was a war and the folks involved were your friends, your neighbors, your teachers. But the problem is, when I looked at the news, I didn't recognize anyone. I just saw kind of numbers, crowds, and that was really hard for me. I didn't feel like anyone around me understood that these were people. There was one story that touched me, though, that I read in the newspaper about a young man named Rami Basisa from the city of Homs in Syria. He was a violinist. Homs was quite famous for its music. And when he escaped to Europe, as you may know, they had cut off all of the borders. So if you wanted to get to Europe, you had to risk your life and go in a small rubber boat by sea. And he wanted to take his violin with him, but of course he didn't want it to get ruined. So he did what you do. He took his violin and he wrapped it in saran wrap, right, in plastic wrap. And he took the boat and he survived. And when he arrived on the other side, of course, everyone around him was just thankful to be alive, but scared and cold. And he unwrapped his violin and he played Ode to Joy. And a photographer was there and took a picture. That was one of the few times where I saw the news and I recognized, okay, these are the people I know. These are the stories I hear. Well, folks started telling other stories among themselves. Survivors would talk about sharing their recipes in the camps, carrying their lullabies, saving their languages. And so I thought maybe the world needed to hear some of these stories. So I decided to travel around the world and to meet people who escaped Iraq and Syria. We'd heard plenty of stories about what they lost, but I was curious about what they saved. First of all, I think that's a more hopeful way to tell a story if you're going to ask someone. But I think I stole this part from a romantic comedy, but there is a movie in which somebody says you should always at least be the main character in your own life. And it seems to me that we were hearing stories in which people weren't even allowed to be the main characters in their own lives. That things were happening to them in the story instead of what was really happening. They were saving their family. They were helping their friends. So I went and looked for some of these stories. Just flip them quickly. People saving their instruments. This is the buzuk. People saving their recipes for sweets. That's from Aleppo. Oh, wrong direction. That's maftul. People saving their embroidery. All of these people are scattered around the world. The tailors in Aleppo were famous. I met him in Amsterdam. And this woman told me I wasn't able to bring my jasmine with me, and so I brought a photograph of jasmine. Eventually, after speaking to, dozens of people, I decided to narrow my book down at least to this area, these 5 cities between Mosul and Iraq and Aleppo. a very diverse region that has lots of languages, lots of religions, Yazidis, Muslims, Christians living side by side, speaking Arabic, Aramaic, Kurdish. And as you see, the people I talked to ended up all over the world, all the way from England and the Netherlands to Australia. So I'm going to tell a few stories, and then we're going to have some questions, and then maybe I'll tell some more stories. But I'll just start with the beginning. Has anyone here heard of a place called Karakosh? I guess those who've read the book have. So Karakosh, I'm Syriac Catholic, so this was a town that was Syriac Catholic in Iraq. About 44,000 people who speak a dialect of Aramaic, so the language that Jesus spoke. In 2014, ISIS, who we call Daesh in the Middle East, entered into this town, and the entire town had to escape. So that would be like, Eau Claire is here one day, and then the next day it's empty. Everyone was gone. They started scattering around the world, and 2 years later, I went to Jordan in order to speak to them. So you'll appreciate what I had to do. So I was in Amman, and I didn't know where to find them. And so I asked my bishop, and he said, well, they all go to the same church. So I went to church, and something really extraordinary happened. It was the Mass. They were speaking Arabic instead of their language. Everybody looked really tired and kind of disoriented. And then the choir started to sing a traditional song from their tradition in Syriac. And when that happened, everybody started to sing along, and it was like they were home again. I mean, I think that happens sometimes in Mass, where there's a song that everyone knows and everyone starts singing, and then suddenly you're together, you're a community again. And so that happened, and I said, well, I need to meet this choir. So I went and I met the choir. Here they are, they're all young people. They were all in college, and they had to escape, of course, without finishing their studies. When they arrived, they thought that they lost everything, but when they saw each other, they remembered that they'd all been in different church choirs. And so they realized that if they got together, they could save their choir. Now, that's a little thing, but if you'll hear them, you'll realize it's not a little thing at all. And that's when I remembered, mustard seeds and leaven bread, that these little things that we do can make a huge difference, not only in our lives and the lives of others, but I think in history. So here you can hear, and you'll just listen because, you're listening to a dialect of Aramaic. Yalla. So the first thing I noticed is, of course, that they didn't have their hymnals anymore because they had to escape without taking anything with them. And so they're using their phones as their hymnals. In time, I'd learned that sort of phones become everything when you escape. They have your photos. They have the voices of people you left behind. They have pictures. Like I said, they have your hymns. So as I started to talk to them about what I was doing, sort of searching for what people brought with them, they said, well, what are you looking for? And that was a good question because I had no idea. I just started. So I said, well, I don't know, maybe someone will talk to me about a song or a recipe or a dress. And that's when that young woman over there, Mina in the red, she said, you have to meet my mom. She said she didn't bring anything with her, but she brought something with what she made. Now, that's a sentence I'll never forget because I learned right away that I was asking the wrong question. That very often when people escape, they can't bring anything with them. And so they have to find within themselves this creativity to recreate what they'd left behind. And that's hope. That's really hope. This is Hannah, for example, mother of 3. I'm also a mother of 3. So I met her. She's a little bit shy, but she explained to me that when she escaped Karakosh, it's where she'd lived for centuries and centuries and centuries, speaking one of the oldest languages in the world. When she left and realized she'd never go back again, she didn't really know what to do because this was her home. This was where her ancestors lived. This is where her whole history was. And so one day she just sort of meditated on her life, and she tried to remember what the color of the roof of her church had been, and what the color of the water in her well had been, the color of the apples on the trees, and the exact color of the grass. And then she went to the market and she bought threads in those colors. And she sat down and spent the next 4 months sewing the story of her city into a dress. That's Hannah's dress. It's called a shawl. You'll see in a minute. You wrap it around it. But it's not just a dress. It carries her entire life. It's really a storybook. You'll see on the top right-hand corner, Baghdad, that's what they call her town in Syriac. She's Catholic, like us, so you have symbols for the wheat and the grapes, but her father was also a farmer who made those. Her name in Arabic, the loaves and the fishes. 2 churches. One, the church of Al-Tahara, that was the largest church in Iraq, which was ransacked during the war. The church of Marbahna Mansera, also ransacked during the war. You have a wedding dance, and if you look closely, you'll notice that the older women are wearing this dress on the dress. So you have the dress on the dress, and the musicians, and her home, her well, as I told you, and these lines which represent, she says, diversity, and the faded one at the bottom, which is for her exile. She said life will never be as colorful as it was, but she will continue. So I begin the book with Hannah not only because I met her first, but because she really reminded me of our humanity and of the humanity of all people we meet who are displaced. Today, it's really easy to just collapse into numbers. If you can believe it, as I speak, 1 in every 69 people on Earth has been forcibly displaced. 1 in every 69. Those are the latest numbers. It's extraordinary. So it's really easy to just get lost in that. And so meeting Hannah reminded me that every single person we meet is not only a person, but a world, with languages and family and dances, places they left behind, colors they dream in. And she just happened to sew it into a dress. She also reminded me of how unique I am, how unique all of us are. And I thought of my former spiritual director, Hans Putman, who used to say, whenever we meet one another, I want to take off my shoes because I'm on holy ground. The absolute holiness of every single human being who we meet. I think I'm just going to tell one more story, and then we're going to have conversation, and I'll tell stories as we're having a conversation. The next story is a favorite, and it's called Farhad's Song. It takes place in Al-Hasakeh, which is in Syria, but very close to Karakosh. So you can see, like, it's called Syria, it's called Iraq, but these places have a lot in common with each other, and they're really close to each other. So that's Farhad with the green eyes, or blue eyes, and that's Hozan. They're best friends. And by best friends, I mean best friends. They call each other soul friends, as we say in the Middle East. They grew up in the same neighborhood. They did everything together. And they grew up in a place where they spoke Kurdish. Well, the government in Syria believed in Arab nationalism, which means that you can't speak Kurdish. You can't speak it at school. You can't learn your history. And so how did they get around that? Well, the musicians became the historians. They learned all of the songs, all of the histories, and they would sing them. The children would learn the songs, and in that way, they would learn their history. When they were kids, there was something called danuk, and that was when the old women would get together and they would have these huge pots of porridge, and they would slowly stir them, and while they stirred them, the storytellers would come and sing, and the children would sing back until they memorized them. And if someone came and said, "Why are all of these people gathered?" they would say, "Oh, we're just waiting for food." And in that day, he realized that music and story and history nourished them. Well, there's one little thing. I won't even read it. I'll just tell you. Or maybe I should read it. Oh, yeah. This is how close they were. He tells this story from their weddings. He said, "At weddings, Farhad would dance 16 different types of dances, and the storytellers would sing, and relatives and friends would celebrate for 3 long days. He remembers sitting at the weddings with the other children, each one asking the other, 'Who are your 7 grandfathers?' And he would name his grandfathers for the last 7 generations. Ahmed, Alo, Haj Ahmed, Saksjunes, Kutu, Mirzo, and Miho. And at one point as he spoke, a girl might jump up, recognizing that 6 or 7 generations ago, they shared the same grandfather. Or another boy might call out his grandfathers, and Farhad would smile as he named one of his own. They weren't strangers at all, none of them were. In fact, they all belonged to one another. So Farhad is just somebody who had this deep sense of how we belong to one another. Farhad and Hozan went off to become musicians. They studied in Homs, but then the war started and they were forced to escape. They went home and then across the border into Turkey where I met them. And as happens, they fell into a deep depression because they lost everything. They lost their diplomas, they lost their friends, they lost their language, they lost their culture. And then Farhad's beloved sister, Aveen, who's a violin player, in 2015 was killed in a bombing. But when that happened and he reached his lowest point, he said he felt part of her enter into his heart. And he'd only played the guitar until then, but he felt her telling him, "It's your time to sing. It's time to sing the songs that you learned when you were a child." And so Farhad and Hozan created a band. And what did they name it? They named it Danuk, after the porridge which was stirred by the old women. And they decided that they would save their songs, and in doing so, save their history. Because if you can imagine that if you're not allowed to learn your history and it's only in songs, and all of the singers leave, that would be like all of the books in your library scattering around the world. But he knew that as long as he sang the songs, they still existed. And so I'll play a little bit. First, this is the buzuk.
ما تزين ودي مني في ساعتي
So I like to play quite a lot of that. First of all, the worst part of any presentation is turning off that song, I have to tell you. But also because you can see the way Hosan's fingers go really close to one another. And for any of you who've read the book already, that's because he's playing microtones. The buzuk has notes between our notes. So it means in meeting them, you hear sounds that you didn't even know existed, the notes between the notes, which I think is also just a really deep metaphor for what happens in relationship, where you discover sort of new sounds you didn't even know were there. So they started playing, lots of people started coming, and they would dance. And that is when Farhad understood that he thought he was doing one thing, but actually he was doing another. Which is that Farhad had set out to save his history, which he was, to save his songs, which he was. But when he saw those people dancing while the war was still going on, he understood that the real thing they were doing was saving joy. That people had forgotten that joy was possible. But when they heard music, they remembered the times in the past where they danced at weddings, at parties. And when they heard that music, they remembered that joy had been possible, and so joy might be possible again. He said, "We are trying to hear happiness. There are many people who are working on the war, making things about the sadness, the loss. Okay, that's fine. Everyone knows that. But there must be another road which reveals our strength." He has this beautiful line in the book, which people often quote back to me, about when I go to meet him, I follow the story for several months, several years actually. And at one point, when I first meet him, he's kind of this famous music star in Istanbul. The next time I meet him, he's in England starting over, doesn't speak the language, he's working in a corner restaurant, he's mopping the floors. And he tells me, he said, "Sometimes I ask myself, how did I start from being a student to being a musician to mopping floors?" And he said, "But on the days when I'm tempted to go back, I remember something I read once, which said, 'Don't go back. The distance to go back is the same as going forward.'" And I thought that's so profound. The distance to go back is the same as going forward. And today, in fact, he's back in school and has a son and is married and has this extraordinary life. And it's been such a privilege to watch it all along. The other stories in the book, I will just tell you, and then we will have a conversation. There's one about a young man named Munir who helps others. It's really that kind of look for the helpers that Fred Rogers says. He helps others, and he saves his kindness. There's a couple who saved their pharmacy by remaking it in a garage in the middle of the war, and somehow saved their compassion. And then the last story is a young Yazidi man who saves his family and saves the story of what happened to them so that it will be remembered. It's a privilege to tell their stories. And I always say that in the Middle East, we have a different idea of story, which is that you don't just hear it and leave it behind. When you hear a story, you become part of it, like Farhad did. You become part of it, and you have a responsibility to live differently now that you know it. So I share their stories in the hope that you'll take them to heart and carry them with you. So I'm going to take the other mic, and we can have a conversation, and if other stories come up, I can tell them. Does that work? Yes, great.
After, and I haven't read the whole book yet, but after reading it, there was one part where you had said that you still haven't recovered. And I'm a chaplain, so that touches my heart in a deep way. And I know how different stories that I've been uniquely a part of have touched me. But how do you carry on? How do you heal from that?
Thank you. The story he's referring to is actually Munir's story. It's a story of a young man who lived through the war in Mosul in Iraq, and was just incredibly kind. So I met him in Lesbos. Does anyone here hear about what happened in Lesbos? So Lesbos is an island in the middle of Greece that they turned into what they call a hotspot, which meant that anybody who was trying to reach Europe, if they caught them, they would put them on this island. And they had a prison camp in it that was so bad that Pope Francis referred to it as, basically as the camps, as a concentration camp, he called it. And why is that? Because they decided that the best strategy to stop refugees was to make the camp worse than the war. So they put too many people in it. They made it so that there weren't enough bathrooms. They made the food disgusting, and they just harassed the people. It was the middle of winter. There were kids sleeping underneath the trees. And these are the people, you have to imagine, these are the people who, when I have a French passport also, when I went to their country, they welcomed me into their homes. They gave me their food. They gave me their beds. They took care of me. And then I saw them arrive on my shores, and they were left to freeze to death underneath the trees. And that's what I still haven't recovered from. And I met this young man, Munir, who was kind. And I don't know how you can stay kind in a situation like that, but he was extraordinarily kind. And when I asked him to tell me a story, the story he told me was of when he was in Iraq during the war, and his sisters wanted to go to school, but it was too dangerous. And so he said, I was never able to study, so I became the candle by which my sisters studied. He said, both of them graduated in computer science. Every day I walked them to the door and placed them there at the university. At the end of the day, I walked there and waited to take them by the hand. There was a huge chance that I was going to die from a bomb, but I was waiting for them. And he simply gave himself, and his name Munir actually means luminous in Arabic. And so he became himself, his deepest self, in these horrific conditions. The question of how I carry a story like this is the only way I can begin to heal is by telling their stories. That's it. I mean, by telling their stories, I hope to at least feel that I did what I could. I mean, the book ends with this plea from this young man who escaped genocide who said, I hope that you will tell our stories. I hope that people will hear what happened to us. The people I met just wanted their stories to be out there. And I won't say I'm completely healed, but for me, the journey is in honoring that promise that I made to them. Well, thank you for the question. Others, help me out, please.
This isn't a story, but what country is your country? I mean, you said you have a French passport, but I'm presuming you have a place that you claim in the Middle East, or maybe I'm wrong.
I don't claim a place in the Middle East, but I live in the Holy Land, which means in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. My husband is a parish priest in the Syriac church, and we've been in the Holy Land for about 18 years, so some of you have met us there. But I also lived in Lebanon and Syria, so And culturally, they all speak the same kind of Arabic. So I feel very connected to that area in particular. My kids were born there, and they've grown up there. So, yeah. Sure. Other questions or comments?
I just had a comment. You were talking about, in the beginning, you were kind of talking about the radical hospitality that you've experienced of, don't compliment somebody something where it's going to become yours. When I was in graduate school, I spent a summer in Kazakhstan, and it was the same sort of thing. I learned very quickly, don't say that you like something because they'll try to give it to you. And yeah, so you mentioning that just kind of reminded me of that hospitality that's very common in that part of the world, Central Asia, the Middle East. So it's just a good memory. So thanks.
Thank you. I guess that could lead us to the last story that I was going to tell today, which is exactly about hospitality. It's about these pharmacists named Gadir and Adnan from Aleppo who fell in love. But in Aleppo, if you can, you're supposed to, if you want to get married, buy a house. And Adnan, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to buy a pharmacy. So he was worried that she wouldn't take him seriously. But she was very supportive, and he bought this pharmacy. And it was extremely successful. They had their first child and their second child. But then the war started, and they lost the pharmacy. And not only did they lose the pharmacy, since they bought the pharmacy, they lost their house because they needed the money of the pharmacy for rent. So it's one of those stories in the war of people who were doing really well, and then the next day they have nothing. Doctors, pharmacists started escaping Aleppo, and Adnan's uncle left an empty house. And he said, well, you guys may as well live in it and keep it safe. So they moved into this empty house on the other side of Aleppo. The war continued. There was no electricity. It was freezing. More doctors left. More pharmacists left. They started hearing from their neighbors that they couldn't get medicine anymore. And so slowly, they started walking at the house, looking at it, looking at the garage, and starting to think, what if they turned the garage into a pharmacy? But everybody told them they're crazy because you don't build a pharmacy in a garage. And you certainly don't do it in the middle of a war, because in wartime, if you have anything, you save it to escape. You don't invest it. But Gadir, who's really extraordinary, she said, we don't wait until the war is over before we live our lives. We live our lives now. But they didn't have any money or materials to build a pharmacy, and that's when Gadir discovered that she had what she calls the eyes of creation, which is that she could look into the ruins of the city, and in the ruins, find the materials to build something new. So maybe a broken chair wasn't really broken, a desk wasn't really broken. Adnan went back to his old pharmacy, which was destroyed, for one day so he could take the diploma off the wall and put it in the garage. And so they opened. They had enough money to buy one of two or each thing. I'll show you what it looked like. Looks like a real pharmacy in a garage. Yeah. So she just took a lot of care, making everything look really pretty, and pushed it to the front of the shelves so it looked really full. And people started coming, but not enough. And so then they wondered, what should they do? How could they compete? And they realized they would never be a real pharmacy, but they had something other pharmacies didn't have, and that was they had themselves. They had their own inner gifts. And they came up with the rules of the pharmacy. And the rules of the pharmacy were, be available. They decided to wake up really early and stay there really late, because during wartime, nothing works, ever. And so they thought if their neighbors saw something working, something that was always there, it would calm their nerves. Be attentive. They decided to learn everybody's names and to learn the names of their kids and to call them during the week to see if they were feeling better. To be dependable, they decided that if they didn't have something, they would go and get it from across the city so that other people wouldn't have to take the dangerous journey. And be kind. They offered people coffee and a place to sit, a place to relax. So they started implementing this, one after another. And I'll just read a little bit of what happens. It says, Aleppo had become the front lines of the civil war. If you went to buy bread, you didn't know if you would come back again. The neighbors were becoming exhausted. By then, no one had a family in which people hadn't left the country. They were mourning their sons, their daughters, their parents, their siblings. They would come in to buy aspirin, and Gadir would ask, "How are you?" It was not an easy question to ask or to answer. She would offer them coffee, listen, smile, take a bottle from the barely stocked shelves, or set out into the war-torn streets to buy it from another pharmacy. What should I do? My daughter's making me upset. What should I do? I feel like my son never comes to visit anymore. What should I do? My husband left the country, and now I'm alone with the children. They just wanted someone to talk to, Gadir told me quietly. Someone to whom they could say, "I'm tired." This was medicine for the soul. So slowly, people start coming from further and further away, but not to buy medicine, simply to talk to somebody. And they offered what they saved in this garage was not a pharmacy, but precisely this hospitality, this famous way of welcoming, which became for me, after this story, I decided to study spiritual accompaniment. I said, I want to be like Adnan and Gadir and be able to sit and listen with others. Other questions or comments?
You did mention that you have 3 kids. Knowing the environment that they are growing up in, what is your hope for them for the future?
Wow, I have so many hopes for them. First of all, I hope they're not mad at me. I told my son Joseph the other day, I don't know, we just gotten some really bad news. And I said, gosh, war happens to the best people. And he said, no, Mom, maybe the best people come out of war. And I was struck by that because he's just witnessed in his young life people who don't have any money and still give away bread for free, taxi drivers who can't afford gasoline and still offer him a ride. And so I guess what I hope for my kids, first and foremost, is peace, that these stupid wars will be finished. I hope that, like these people, he'll come out of it, my children will come out of it more creative and more resilient and more compassionate. And I hope that they'll grow up and have beautiful families and tell them stories. When I was your age, I had to go to school during the war. And their kids will just be annoyed because it's just another story, because life will be so different. I hope, I guess, that God takes all of these difficulties and turns them to the good, and I trust that God will. Yeah. And the biggest thing is I hope they hold on to their faith. I hope that they hold on to their faith. Because I guess when you see a choir that can save their prayers and their songs, you realize, if you can hold on to that, you can weather a lot in life. Yeah. Sure.
In how many languages are you fluent?
Fluent's a big word. I'm not even sure I'm fluent in English some days. But I would say that I can speak English, French, and Arabic. And my two oldest speak English, French, Arabic, and Spanish. So, yeah, to varying degrees, yeah.
In a few weeks, some of us will be welcoming a refugee family. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know exactly when they'll be here. And I'm wondering if you could offer us some helpful ideas about how to help them to adjust.
Sure. I was talking to Father Tom and said most times the most important thing is the spice cabinet. So that is like the most overlooked and most essential aspect of welcoming anyone, is making sure they have every spice that they normally have. So there are places on the internet which have very good sourced spices, so don't skimp. Another thing, this seems small, but don't give them your leftovers, give them the best of what you have. That's a big thing. Folks come in and people give them what they have left. That's nice. But if you can give the best of what you have, give the best of what you have. I always think of this story, I don't know if it's true or not, of somebody who gave Dorothy Day pearls and said, you can sell these and give the money to the poor. And she said, why can't the poor have nice things? So give the best of what you have, and maybe even better than what you have. This is the tradition we have in many of these countries. You don't even give somebody what you could have. You give them what you wouldn't even buy for yourself. So that's generosity, and that's hospitality. Spices, kind of audacious generosity. And depending on where they're from, seeds. I'll tell you a story about that. This is one of the most important things. Okay, that's the pharmacy. The last story. So this is the story that impacted me the most, but I don't tell it in the book because it doesn't fall geographically where I was. But there's a reason why I start with eggplant seeds. So when I first started the work, I was in the north of Jordan and asking people who came from Syria, who escaped, what they brought with them. And they told me this story. So this woman, she's from Dera in the south of Syria, and she's showing me something, and what she's showing me is makdous. So makdous is this small stuffed eggplant that Syrians are obsessed with. You can tell if there's ever a Syrian in the audience when I tell this story, because either they start cheering or they start laughing. It is the most beloved of Syrian foods. So small eggplants stuffed with walnuts and peppers and pickled. So when the first wave of refugees crossed the border, they discovered, much to their dismay, that the eggplants in Jordan were too big for makdous. Now, this was a disaster. I mean, the war is a disaster, but the eggplant situation is also very, very bad. So they called their relatives who were still in the war and said, if, God forbid, you have to escape, bring us our seeds. And the next generation, or not, the next wave of refugees came, and they brought seeds to their eggplants, and by the time I arrived, you could get perfect Syrian eggplants in the north of Jordan, which of course for me showed, wow, this really is a story. I'm not just imagining this, that we can save something and save something small, and it means the world to people. Now, I've told this story many times, and I've learned it's not a rare story at all. So you can get seeds from places all over the world. So if it turns out that the family who comes had a garden, work with them so that they can have their eggplants, they can have their peppers, and it will be a way of having home with them here. So, and also, I mean, as we say, take everyone as your teacher. So as much as you hope to help them, also learn from them, because every single one of these folks has such a story and so much to give.
I first became acquainted with you, not in the book, but in the essay you wrote for America Magazine last year in December. And in that essay, you wrote about seeds. Maybe just share a little bit about that story of seeds, and what might you write in an essay this year during Advent as we anticipate Christmas?
Sure. What he's referring to is when the war started, I was walking in Bethlehem, and we were all completely terrified. We didn't know what was going to happen. And I saw a store that was packed with people. And so I walked in, and people were shouting out, 5 shekels for arugula, 5 shekels for mint, 5 shekels for onions. And I realized that everyone was buying seeds, and that was their immediate response to a situation, is to plant. And I have always said that if you have the privilege of people whose first reaction to a crisis is to plant seeds, then you're a lucky person indeed. And so I did that, actually. I had then started to plant my first garden. It was not terribly successful, but I had very good fava beans, which are in the freezer, and I will never eat them. But it was wonderful, but it was also, you could see how time had passed. My next book is about planting, about the liturgical year and planting and fruits and vegetables, but it's also about hope and about how you hope during times that seem hopeless. And I've learned to use a little trick that we have in Arabic and in English, Arabic and French, which is that in both Arabic and French you have 2 words for hope. In French we have espoir and espérance. And espoir is kind of the work that you do on your own, like I hope I can make these fava beans grow. But espérance, that's theological hope. That's a hope that comes from God, and that hope can never be destroyed. It's eternal. And so as Father Franz, a priest once told me, it's great in French because you cannot have hope and still have hope. And so it's actually really useful in a time of war to realize that when we reach the limits of our hope, we can call on a greater hope to sustain us. I don't think that just belongs to us. I think that's something that belongs to humanity. And I think the folks in this book do that. They somehow key into some greater hope to sustain them when they reach the limits of their hope. So I want to write about that because, as they say, write the book you need to read, and I need to read that right now. We have 4 minutes maybe, so one more question. Yes.
I think I heard you say that your subjects had sort of resigned themselves not to return ever to Syria. And that seems to contrast to what I understand is the thinking of many Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza that would like to return to their families' homes in Israel that they had to flee from in 1947.
Yes, but they would only want to do that if it's safe. So that is the key difference, is that to return when it's safe, and certainly they cannot return at the moment, and most Syrians feel it's not safe for them to return, and none of the characters in this book feel that it's safe for them to return. But even if they should choose to return, Pope Francis has spoken clearly about the choice to stay and the choice to leave, which is that it's not up to us to tell people that they should stay. It's not up to us to tell people that they should leave. It's up to us to accompany people in their freedom to choose whether they want to stay or whether they want to leave. That means contributing to places like Jesuit refugee services who are helping folks in war so that they can survive with their families should they stay. And that means welcoming families here in Eau Claire so that they can start over should they leave. So that's what we do. We accompany people should they stay. We accompany people should they leave. Our task is simply to accompany.
Well, I'm just so grateful for this hour. We kind of planned it a while ago, and last year we thought we might pull it off, but we didn't. And what can I say? I mean, you read the book, those who read it liked it, then you get to see the author and her. Doesn't she just have a loving, open spirit that makes you kind of want to have the same? Yeah? And so, yeah. Yeah. Oh, look at this. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to respond to that at all. But that's right. I know, there's something about listening to her talk when she spoke to, she is the wife of the man who directed my sabbatical, and you might have remember that she said she's married a priest, and it's like, how's that? And he's Catholic, different rites, so Syrian Catholics can be married. And, but I just loved every minute. So that's how I got to meet her. And then she spoke to us, and I just thought, boy, she can, like, what did you say? She's a journalist who writes in poetry or something? A journalist who writes in poetry and touches our hearts. And so, but the sense of communion, the dignity you bring out in people, hearing stories, and may we all be as open to one another as she's been open to people. One question I would just ask you quick is, was it hard to connect with people, or just show up and I'm a journalist, I want to interview you, or how did the spark start where you really were able to have those relationships?
I guess I just tried to learn a lot about places. So by the time I started, if I met somebody, I could say, oh, you're the place that's famous for this sweets, or you're the place that, oh, I've heard about this from where you are. And it's a small thing, but then people realize that you saw them as a person from a place. And we also have something in Arabic which is called latafa. It's like a way of speaking which is elevated, so that you can, by speaking to someone, you show them that you respect them. And so it means that you can speak to someone in such a way right away that they know that you hold them in esteem. And so by those things, there's a sort of trust which is formed, and they're just friendly. Yeah.
That's something we can all learn from, right? As we try to build community here in our city. Maybe we want to read up when we hear where the refugees are from that come here, read up on where they're from and what that's like. So I'd like to invite anybody who'd like to go next door to the gathering space. There are books available. If you get them in a bookstore, there'd be $29 plus tax. If you get them here, they're just $20, no tax. And we have about 30 of them available. I know a lot of you have them already, and Stephanie will be there to sign some books, whether you brought your book or would get a new one. Beyond that, why don't we give her a blessing? You just stood, so why don't we stand up and we thank you, God, for giving us Stephanie, for being light in our world, for being a witness to statistics, to putting faces and actions and memories and stories on precious people, all precious in your eyes, and we're mindful of the millions that don't have anyone to tell their story. And help us hold them in our hearts this night as well. May we all learn to respect the dignity of everybody and cherish every life. And as you go forth, Stephanie, may you be blessed and safe travels to your home. And may you bring peace, hope, and light to a war-torn, tough country where there's a lot of oppression and difficulty. And may you have hope in your work and hope in God all the days of your life. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to whisk Stephanie away to the gathering space.